I wanted to make sure that if you see that someone is not on the meeting yet who you thought would likely be here, if you would check your email and send it to anyone. The new link is a Zoom link. Those of you who are already on know that, but originally it looked like a Teams Connect, and this is a Zoom meeting. So if there's someone you think might need to get that Zoom link, if you would forward it to them, we'd appreciate it. We're going to give it a couple of minutes for other people to sign in before we get started. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you so much for volunteering or voluntolding your time for this great task force. Feel like we've already made a lot of progress and gathering good information. And I think today is going to be yet another excellent day of gathering. And I want to thank Emily and Mary Claire, particularly for the work that they've done in helping us with all of this. So the overall plan of the meeting is to have, we're lucky to have Tennessee Early Intervention System staff here to answer many questions that we have gathered today. And so we'll do that. And then we're going to hear again from Dr. Edney about what his thoughts are and where we are. But we want to make sure that everybody know we have time for questions and would love for our task force to participate, ask any questions of clarification or anything. I think maybe it would be good if you would take notes as we move through, though, with the questions of Tennessee, to Tennessee's early intervention. Let us get through the questions. There are a lot of them. And when we get through them, if you have further questions, feel free to join in then. So I guess, so now we'll go ahead and start. I'm going to call the meeting to order, and I'm going to ask Mary Claire to do our roll call for us.
Hey, everybody. Just as always, if you're here on Zoom or in person, just say here or hi or whatever you'd like to say. Dr. Buttress is here with us today. Representative Richard Bennett. Senator Hob Bryan. Senator Nicole Boyd.
Here.
Thank you. Ms. Kay Carr.
Here.
Miss Miranda Carter. And she's not here. Dr. Daniel Edney is here. Representative Kevin Felsher.
Here.
Dr. Tanya Fitz.
Here.
Dr. Heather Hanna.
Here.
Miss Biz Harris.
Here.
Dr. Carlin Hennington. Senator Chris Johnson. Miss Leslie Junkin. Dr. Sophia Leggett. Senator Tyler McCon.
Here.
Thank you. Representative Mims is here. Dr. Denise Elaine Powell.
Here.
Representative John Reed. Dr. Courtney Walker. Mr. Keith Van Cannon. And then our advisors, Dr. Julie Parker.
Here.
Dr. Kenya Elizabeth Wolf.
Here.
Miss Penny Manziel.
Here.
Dr. Catherine Cassidy.
Here.
Dr. LaShonda Carson.
Here.
Dr. Candace Carter Stevens.
Present.
Dr.
Present.
William A. Brown. Miss Sarah Myers.
Here.
And then we also have staff from Tennessee's Early Intervention System. And we have from the State Department of Health, Miss Chris Adcock. And we'd also like to thank Francis Woodard for being here today as our ASL interpreter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you all received the minutes from our meeting on August the 14th. So I would, if you have not had a moment, I'll give you just a couple of minutes to review them. And then I'd like for someone to, unless there are any corrections, submit a motion for approval. We do have a quorum.
Motion to approve.
That motion is by, who is that?
Boyd.
Oh, Senator Boyd, thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so we will go on to the Q&A with the staff of the Tennessee Early Intervention System, and we have 60 minutes for that. So with that, if you would, staff, if you would introduce yourself, we'd appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. My name is Shannon Pargin, and I am the Director of IDEA Implementation with Tennessee Early Intervention System. And also on the call is Susan Rollison, and she is with our Tennessee chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And she also, her program helps support child find efforts. We have a contract with them. So those are some pieces that we'll be speaking to, and she joined the call as well.
Excellent and welcome. I was just in your lovely state and Franklin last weekend for the Tennessee chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. It was an excellent meeting and I enjoyed it. So thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you having us. I do want to extend our Assistant Commissioner Kelly Hyde is out with a family emergency, or else she would have loved to have been here today. So she extends her apologies.
Well, we really, really appreciate your time. We know that Tennessee has made a great deal of progress over the last several years, made some real changes. And so we've set up some questions, and feel free if you expand on something, we may be able to delete some of our questions as we move along. But the first question that we have for you is, Shannon and Susan, you can pass these back, or I don't know, Shannon, if you want to answer each one and then have Susan make comment, however you want. But our first question is basically, how is Tennessee's early intervention program structured at the state and then the local level? If you'd give us an overview, please.
Yeah, of course. So our lead agency for early intervention services in Tennessee is the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So we did change lead agencies in 2020. Prior to that, we were under the Department of Education. Our state office, our Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, houses our central office, as well as all of our 9 point of entry offices across the state. And so we're responsible for a lot of things at that state level, including all service coordination. So, and I think there's a question a little bit later about that. I'm happy to go into that in a little bit more detail now, or I can wait. I think it's actually the next question. So
yeah, the next question is, what functions do the lead agency do? So you're right, it is the very next one.
So I'll answer that, and then I'll circle back to what services do we contract for and what does that look like. So
Perfect.
Our lead agency, our central office, what we consider a central office, we have oversight for all of the services across the state. We handle all contracts, the monitoring, training and professional development, policies and procedures, our state interagency coordinating council, and other stakeholder work, all of our data systems, our federal application, our reporting. We work with others in our department for budgeting and billing. We do our strategic planning and problem solving, performance management, and also centralized referrals. And there's probably other things in there that I'm missing, but those are big buckets. Our point of entry offices that we have across the state, they really handle local implementation. We work very closely with them. So local implementation and oversight, service coordination, eligibility determination, transition planning, and extended option. So we do implement the extended option for children over the age of 3.
So would you just explain that, if you will,
Yes.
the extended option piece?
Yes. So once children turn 3 or they're approaching their 3rd birthday, if they are eligible for the Part B 619 services, they have a choice. So in Tennessee, they can either opt to stay in Part C services and continue to receive those, or they can move on to the Part B services. and it's the family's choice. And they can choose to stay in Part C for a while and then move on to Part B. So it's up to them. We currently offer that through the start of school to their 4th birthday. We are just waiting for the final approval from Sept to extend that to the 5th birthday.
I'm sure there'll be some further questions along those
Yeah.
lines, but we'll
Yeah.
keep going on that. Okay.
Yes.
And you
And
call
then-
that the extended services option?
Yeah, it's the extended option. It's part of the application packages that states can submit when they do the federal application for services. So
talk to us about the process for the procedure for processing referrals and selecting service providers.
before I talk about that a little bit further, let me circle back and just talk about the things we contract for and then how that's set up. Our contracts run from our lead agency, our central office, to local. And we contract for evaluations for children, so those eligibility evaluations as well as ongoing assessment. We have particular contracts for early intervention, what we call early intervention resource agencies, to provide the service of developmental therapy. And so that's that combination of special instruction and family training under IDEA. And then we have vendor services. Those are all of the physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, all of those, behavior, and interpreters. So we have a lot of contracts for those things. And then we have some other contracts to support other work that's not as direct services. So that would be where our contract with the AAP comes in. So that's where Susan's work comes in, and they do start training for providers across the state, medical providers, to help train them on doing behavioral screenings or developmental screenings in their offices, and then what to do with the results of those screenings and when to refer kids to early intervention. And we have some others like family survey analysis and that sort of thing. So that would be the contracted work. Any questions about that? And then I'll talk about how we process referrals.
I think later we have some more questions about the 9 different offices. So why don't we
Perfect.
just
All
go
right,
ahead.
sounds
Yeah.
good. So for processing referrals, we do have a centralized referral team. That was a change we made in the last year. It used to be that those referrals would come into those 9 point of entry offices, but we've actually centralized that. So we now have a centralized referral team, and they process all the referrals for the state. We have an 800 number. All of our local point of entry offices have an option to, it's an auto attendant. So it's like select option 2 for referrals, and it sends it to that team. We have a centralized email. We have an online referral form. They can send it via fax. They have a dedicated fax line for that team. And so they process all of those referrals and assign that evaluation agency to do that initial eligibility eval. And the service coordinator in the point of entry office really doesn't get involved unless the child, until it's coming into that eligibility. So we have eligibility specialists at each of our 9 point of entry offices. So they would determine eligibility, work on getting medical records from providers. That's part of our eligibility criteria, and make those determinations of eligibility. And then a service coordinator isn't assigned until the child's determined eligible. And so then they would work on writing the IFSP.
So basically, when an individual is referred in, they go directly to eligibility, or is there a rescreening done?
We do not do screenings any longer. We eliminated that practice several years ago as part of our state systemic improvement plan. We found that we were having some gaps in our eligibility. We had a lot of kids that were coming to us late and eligible. And when we really started digging into that process and breaking it down, we found that our screening might not have been sensitive enough to pick up kids earlier in the process. And once we really dug into that, we decided to eliminate screening. That's when we started contracting for evaluations. We didn't have enough staff in-house to handle that. So we started contracting for that service so we could send every child straight to evaluation and skip the screening. And that made a big difference in our not just our numbers of kids who are eligible, but also our number of referrals we received. We didn't realize how many referrals were being held back due to, I'm going to say probably frustration with the screening process, because providers were doing screenings in their offices and then sending to us, and we might be doing a different screening and getting a different result. We also heard from parents who were a little confused about that front end process, because there'd be a referral and someone would come out and do a screening, and then somebody else would do a process that looked very similar to that. And so that was, it felt like a lot of things had to occur before they saw something that looked like a service. So we took all of that information and decided to eliminate screening. It's been a successful decision for us, but it did result in quite a bit of growth. So.
If you will, tell us what made you determine the need to go back to the centralized intake rather than allowing the 9 point of entries to do that.
We never had a centralized intake before, so this is a new process for us. But for us, it was a matter of equity, because our 9 point of entry offices aren't the same size. And so the number of referrals, each one of them had a dedicated administrative support, but the number of referrals that person had to process would vary greatly. And so you had some offices where they were getting a lot of admin support for their service coordinators, because that person, the amount of time they had to spend on referrals was a lot less than a much larger office. And so we wanted to really be able to allow those admins to truly support the staff that work there. And so we looked at how could we do that? And the way to do that is to take referrals off of their plates.
So how does thank you. That was helpful.
Yeah.
How does the lead agency oversee monitoring and compliance of the individual programs?
So that is actually part of my team. And we do, I'll speak to the local part first. So the point of entry office, when we're looking at the indicator monitoring, you know, the 1, 7, and 8, the things that you have to report on your annual performance report, that's really handled in a couple of ways. So our service coordinators, as part of their job performance plans, have some requirements about the expectation of every child receiving things in a timely manner. And so throughout the year, their supervisors are sampling records and following up on ones that may be outside of that time frame. And then annually, my team handles the compliance monitoring. So they pull the data, review the records, and determine where the, I'm sorry, I'm getting a thunderstorm, determine where that district office fell and write findings of noncompliance based on that district's performance.
So your office is, did I hear this correctly, oversees the credentialing for all the 9 individual sites. Is that correct?
No, we do the monitoring.
Right. Who does the credentialing? Is that done at the individual offices, 9 offices?
I'm not sure what you're referring to as credentialing.
Qualifying the providers as early intervention providers.
Okay, so I think I know what you're referring to. So in the past, we had a credential, and it was in-house. It was an exam that the early intervention, those EIRA contracts, developmental therapy providers would take. And that's something that we don't offer currently. But we do currently have a task force that's looking more at offering it wouldn't be a credential, but looking at offering something as more of a working in universities for people who are coming into the field as maybe an enticement to go into early intervention.
Okay, I think that makes sense. We can come back to that if others
Okay.
have further questions. So what criteria did the local programs have to meet to be enrolled in the program as a service area?
So service contracts are awarded based on an application process. And so the applications are scored on a rubric, and the criteria include a variety of things. So it could be based on the geographic area, if they're willing to provide home-based services instead of clinic or, over clinic, if they're offering services to at-risk population, the variety of insurances that they accept or work with. So there's a variety of options or things that could be on that rubric. But I will say that having a once every few years application process doesn't help to meet the needs. So our contracts folks we have a team. They are actively and continuously working to expand service provider availability and really seeking to contract with new people. We have an application online. It's an interest form that asks a number of these questions, like where are you willing to serve and what insurances do you accept and those things. So they work on that really hard at all times.
So how are university-based early intervention programs utilized? I know all of your 9 are not linked to a university, but how is
No.
that set up, if you will?
So university programs can apply to be a service provider just like a community-based program and would be scored just like a community-based program. We have a couple of contracts for other things like our family survey processing that's with the university, but I think it just happens to be that's where that lands. But we don't have, that I'm aware of, I don't know that we have special university-based services.
So basically, there's an application process, and if a university met criteria, they could be one.
Mhm.
Are you linked to some universities in Tennessee?
Yes. Yeah, we have a number of service providers who are based in universities.
So here's a tough question. We, like you, have several very rural areas with
Mhm.
low number of service providers. How does your program extend services to those most rural areas?
So I talked about how we actively are recruiting providers. So that's one arm of that. We have a vendor advisory group that is working on service availability due to our growth. Our early intervention resource agencies, that developmental therapy service is available in any part of the state, in the home. And we offer transportation to families. We have a contract for transportation services for families who receive Medicaid. And we also have really expanded our telehealth. And can offer services to families, and maybe some specialty services and things that might not have been available, and some supports to families that way. But the main thing is that those recruitment efforts of services.
So how many staff members does your lead agency employ? You've talked a little bit about their general
Yeah.
responsibilities. I don't know if you want to expand on that, but while you're telling us now, I know Tennessee has more children than Mississippi. So if you will tell us in relation to the number of children served, could you tell us how many children in general are served in Tennessee? Do you know the number? I'm just trying to put this all in perspective for us.
Yeah.
Do you know the number one of your birth to 3 children that you have in your state, and then the percentage served? I know we can find some of those numbers nationally. And then how many providers do you have in your centralized office to coordinate all that?
So we have over 300 staff members employed by the lead agency. Right now, today, we have over 10,000 children with IFSPs. That's just today. And we have around 13,000 children in the system in process, active.
That's quite a bit more. You're serving about 10 times the number of children that we do. So let me ask you, do you, back to that number in Mississippi, in Tennessee, how many children just from birth to 3? What is your pool of children that you are pulling from? Or what percentage, maybe that would be a better way to put it. What percentage of children are you serving in your state?
If you give me a second, I can tell you.
Okay.
But yes.
We want to make sure that we're comparing 300. There were some eyes that got very widened by 300 providers in the central office. That is significantly more than what we have.
I think this is probably a good time to plug our website if you all haven't had a chance to check it out. We have a lot of great information on our website, including a number of reports. So we have a reports and data section.
Yeah, I do see here some data that we have from that Emily's gathered is Tennessee serves 3.69% of children. We serve 1.52. Yeah. Okay.
And I will say that number has grown. I started working for Tennessee in 2013.
Right.
And that the number of children that we've served has grown so much. That's one of the things that we've tackled so much, because we haven't always served this percent of the population. So we're really proud of our child find work that we've done.
So thank you for that. Yes.
Yeah.
And those numbers I gave you were 2021. I'm sure they've gone up some. So how are service providers and coordinators enrolled into the program? Are they all independent contractors? How do they get paid? Can you talk a little bit about, are they required to bill, or is there, are they contracted? And tell us a little bit about your process.
So all service coordinators are direct employees of the lead agency. So we'll pull those out because that's, they're not contracted. They work for the state. For service providers, they are employed through one of those contracts. So it would be one of those, either what we call a vendor contract or one of those other contract types. So that evaluation contract or the developmental therapy contract. And so they are paid the way the and I think I'll touch probably on some of the questions around billing and reimbursement, but it's based on the IFSP services. And each of these look a little bit different for those contract types, but it's the same general. So the services are put on the IFSP, and they're required to enter information into our data system. So there has to be a service log. Then we have a billing team that at the end of the month, they run the invoices for each of these agencies. They look at and reconcile information. They identify if things look odd. So if we've got two people going, we have some validations in the system to prevent this, but if you've got, two people providing the same service to the child at the same time, anything like that will get flagged. And they do some cleanup. And then they bill if the service is a fee for service like PT, OT, speech, they pay those agencies based on that. For the developmental therapy services and the evaluation services, those agencies submit a monthly invoice. And it looks a little bit different, but they submit based on their expenditures.
Okay, so all the billing is by your office, all of that information,
Yeah.
and all of the service coordinators, did that 300 number, is that also including the service coordinators who are?
Yes, the majority of those people are service coordinators.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that answers a lot.
Mhm.
What is the average caseload for service coordinators?
Right now, it's around 60. So we do have, and this is something new that we've implemented in the last year or two. We have a statewide service coordination team because we found that we did have some pockets of the state where it was a little bit more challenging to maintain those staff, or we had a little bit more of a turnover rate. And so we implemented a statewide team. And those folks provide service coordination via telehealth, and they have a higher caseload because they're only doing telehealth. But this allows us, if somebody goes out on leave or you have an unexpected vacancy in one of the offices, it allows those people to step in and fulfill that need without having to distribute that caseload across the other staff in that office and inflate their caseloads. So this 60 is our average for the majority of our caseloads, but those statewide people run more in the 100 range, but that's by design.
Could you just tell us a little bit more about when you use telehealth?
So for telehealth, we have that available for all services, as long as it's supported by the licensing board of that service. So it's an available option for the IFSP team, and it's really up to the family and the IFSP team to decide what model is going to best support their needs. But it's something that we have available and we support for families. So there are certain meetings that in our guidance to staff, we say we prefer that these be in person, like initial and 6-month annual IFSP meetings. But if it's a monthly check-in, that might be something that they opt to do via telehealth or phone call.
This is my individual question. I apologize for
Yeah.
it. But it's, I guess, part of my prerogative. Is telehealth, does that count as services in the natural environment?
We do.
It does. Okay. So how does your legislature determine how much state funding to allocate for the EI program? Do you know that?
This is a little bit outside of my
Right.
ability to answer. I will say that we have really wonderful contact with the fiscal team and the budget team within our department. And they are really knowledgeable about all the regulations that affect early intervention and Part C. And they work really closely just regarding priorities for the department long-term. And so they work with each unit and with the commissioner to develop a budget proposal for the governor. And then the governor hears from each department to put together his budget proposal for the legislature. And then the legislature hears and looks through that and hears from the departments, hears from the governor, and then they set that budget, what that budget will be. But that's about my knowledge of that. So,
Okay.
yes.
We know you're still tweaking your program and making some changes. But could you talk to us about how long, now you said just this, how long have you been operating in your current model right now?
So, and I know model means different things in early intervention. It's one of those words that you can have a whole conversation and realize that I think each person had a different definition of that term. But in terms of having a dedicated service coordination model and having all of the people employed by the lead agency of the state, that was changed in 2007. So prior to that, we had, I would say, a sub-grant sort of system where the money came into the state, and then each part of the state might have its own lead agency kind of division of, and it was operated independently. And so in that situation, you might have a child that was eligible in one part of the state and then could move to another part of the state and may not be eligible for services, or have to kind of redetermine eligibility because they operated so differently. And so we really, my understanding is, before I was there, but in 2007, a lot of effort was made to consolidate and coordinate and really make things equitable and really take more state control. And so that change took place in 2007. And then, like I mentioned, in 2020, we changed lead agencies. So.
And then before I open things up to everyone, do you have any advice on the strengths and weaknesses of implementing an early intervention program through a system such as yours? We've been calling it a hub system. Is that what you would call it?
I'm not familiar with that term, but I think you can, like, if that term works for you, if that's a functional term, I think that's fine. So of course, I think one thing that's apparent is you have to have a lot of support to operate the system the way we are because of the number of staff it takes, like to have your lead agency and have a model of dedicated service coordination such as we have. It takes a lot of support to do that. But one thing, because we're about to go through the OSEP monitoring, the differentiated monitoring and support, on-site monitoring from the Office of Special Education Programs. And one thing that I keep seeing that comes up for me is I do think dedicated service coordination does speak to a lot of the monitoring questions, because there are so many pieces that come up that say, how do you ensure that somebody has oversight of that child's IFSP and that they're making sure that things are happening. and having a dedicated service coordinator that's all that they're doing, and that they're employed by the lead agency really does speak to a lot of that. So I think that's a piece of it.
Thank you.
And I did not even touch on results monitoring at all, but that's a whole other piece that I'm happy to answer questions about. I talked about compliance. I didn't talk about results, but that's something else we launched.
Yeah, we'd love to hear. Go ahead and talk to us about that.
We're on year 2 of that, but it digs a little bit deeper into to areas such as child and family outcomes, and has data flags. So instead of receiving a finding of noncompliance, it really looks at, for example, with the child find areas, are there any gaps? Are there areas of the state where we feel like we're underserving kids, and just developing improvement plans to address that, looking at it from a data element and saying, why do we think this is happening, and what do we think we need to do about that? And then it looks at real-time data versus compliance, which sometimes is looking at data that's old, like, a little bit older. So that's something that we've implemented and had some real success with, and plan to continue. So.
Great. Do you, again, I think we can find this nationally, but speaking of results, how do your numbers look in comparison between Part B and Part C services? We have fewer kids, for example, in Mississippi, we have fewer kids in Part C services than we do in Part B. If you look at the 3-year span, how do y'all compare?
I know that's common to have more kids in Part B than Part C. We always strive to close that window of identification. I can speak to when I first started with Part C in 2013. We got about 10,000 referrals a year,
Mm-hmm.
and now we get over 20. And back in 2013, when I started, of those 10,000 referrals, I think it was around 25 or 30% of those kids were eligible. Might have been a little bit higher than that. I'd have to go look. But now, around 50% of the kids are eligible. And so it's, and resulting in IFSPs, that's the other piece that we're tracking is, are they resulting in IFSPs? And so it's a much larger pool of kids. And that's part of what, in particular, our results monitoring is really trying to hone in on is, are we leaving any eligible kids behind? If so, what can we do about that? And just really digging in deeply into the data to identify any potential gaps. And I think that's just a big part of making sure that you're finding the kids. I think Susan, probably her role too is helps with that quite a bit, and the messaging with doctors, because that is our primary referral source.
Yeah, and one thing that I did skip over, I want to come back to, and then I'll turn it over to the group. Referral information back to providers who referred. How is that going? That is one of those complaints we hear often, is that pediatricians don't hear back once they've referred patients in.
So that's something that we have really worked on. And in the last couple of years, we've changed our releases. And I think that's helped a lot to be able to share information back. So that's good news. And so we try to tell the provider at a minimum the eligibility and sharing the IFSP or that an IFSP was created. It's unique practice to practice what they want. But Susan, anything to add to that?
No, I think you've got it. It's different all over the state. Like Shannon's saying that in West Tennessee, they may just want a letter back saying that they're eligible. And then in Northeast, they may want an IEP, so an IFSP or a copy of it. And we've encouraged them to contact. We really want to build those relationships with their local TEIS agencies. So when we do the START training for it's screening tools and referral training program, TEIS comes with me. So when we do those trainings across the state, they come, we're trying to build those relationships in those communities so that they can feel comfortable reaching back out to TEIS if they need to have answers or questions answered. Because sometimes parents will come back and say things that may like, oh, weren't eligible. I don't know why. And that gives a bad taste to providers. And then you have to go in, it's just more work you have to do on my end and Shannon's end is learning why is this doctor stopped referring? We have to figure those things out. So I consider myself like a liaison between the medical providers and TEIS. And it's worked out well. We've been doing it for about, 15 years. We've held a grant to do this across the state, and we do about 30 to 36 trainings a year for all medical schools across the state. So that's another way TEIS gets in and gets to talk to them about the processes before they even go into practice. They go to all the resident programs. I'm really starting to see a turnaround with that, with doctors going into practice and they've already had that program. And so they know about TEIS already. So it's working very well, I think.
Super. Thank you, Susan.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, what I'd like to do now is most of our attendees are online, virtual, and so our task force, if you will, just unmute if you have a question and please state it. If you, for whatever reason, your mic's not working, Emily, maybe you can help with that. If you rather put it in the chat box, but we have some time designated for any follow-up questions you might have.
Dr. Buttress, this is Julie Parker. Can you hear me?
Second, Julie, yes, we hear you, but we have an interpreter question. Just one sec.
Mhm.
Are we okay? We can go, okay. Battery running low. Sorry about that. Dr. Parker, go ahead with your question.
No, thank you. So Shannon, thank you for all of that information. I have several questions, but I won't ask them all at this point. I am curious though about your service coordinators and how they engage potentially with your contract agencies. You were talking about the importance of their role, which is really significant to families and children. And so we have a dedicated service coordinating system here in Mississippi as well too. But so I have some concerns about there being some disconnect between our service coordinators and some of our service providers. And because your system is a little bit different, I'm just curious as to how, from a regional perspective or a contract agency perspective, how they engage with those agencies and really provide that continuity for families.
Yeah. So part of our state systemic improvement plan has been to work on IFSP teaming. That is something that we've kicked into, I think, high gear starting this year. Really looking at what does that look like? How would we measure that? And really changing our measures, because COVID, that's one thing, it forced our hand a little bit, because how we team now looks a little different than how we used to before telehealth wasn't as much of an option. So we need to update our measures and say, well, what does teaming look like in 2023 and beyond? Because I think we need to change our expectations a little bit. So, and what does teaming look like beyond IFSP meeting participation? Because I think we also had a lot of ideas in our head that IFSP teaming meant that everybody comes to an IFSP meeting and sits in the same room. And IFSP teaming for us and for our service coordinators really involves really connecting with those providers on a regular basis and being that central person who knows everything that's going on and is communicating that, is making sure that things are moving, is getting updated progress reports on the child, is talking to the family, and finding out how things are going from their perspective. And so that service coordinator really has an important role. One thing that they do quite frequently is join those developmental therapy meetings or join other therapy sessions. And we encourage them to do that. We also have special guidance for our service coordinators for kids that are in DCS custody or in child protective custody. So I know those have different acronyms in different states, but for that are in child protective custody or in foster care, we encourage them to lay eyes on the kids a little more often. And so maybe joining those services, those meetings a little bit more frequently as well. And so what does teaming look like there, and setting up some benchmarks there as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That sounds like a really important framework that you're using there, and then also collecting data in regard to that. And I have one more question as it relates to that. So you talked just a little bit about moving forward with service coordinators. So do you have any of your service providers who actually are a primary service provider as well too, which they actually do coordination and service provision? So no PS?
No, we don't.
Okay. And then, so I think I'm understanding from what you said that you guys are really emphasizing this collaborative approach with the service coordinators that work solely from the Part C office in Tennessee with the agencies. And I would assume, maybe, I don't know, tell me if I'm wrong, if you guys are providing lots of like in-service training for that component.
Yes, we have a whole team that really does an amazing job with developing training, having that training available online. A lot of our trainings that we develop, we have the in-house version for our staff, and then we have a similar training for service providers. So they're getting the same information, but anything that would be specific to a state employee, like you log into this system and you do this, but people outside of the state system don't have access to that. You would remove some of those components and make it accessible for people who are providing services, but everyone's hearing the same message. The other thing that we're trying to do, and this is really hard, especially for someone where a lot of my role is developing measurements, but we're also trying to separate out the quantity versus the quality of teaming and interactions between providers and trying to figure out what that looks like. And that's a hard, you need to do both, but we're trying to get out of the, does this count? Sort of, and into measuring what impact does this have? Which is.
Thank you for that, Shannon. Dr. Budges, I have a few more questions, but I'm gonna certainly allow someone else to ask. They probably have some of the same questions I do.
Any other questions? Dr. Parker, thank you. We'll come back to you if we have some time, because I'd like for you to make sure that we get all of your questions answered. Anyone else who would like to unmute and ask questions?
Yes, I have a question. I'm Keith Van Cannon with Caring Hands Rehab. And we are a therapy providing group for physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and special instructors. My question is about the credentialing of the therapist, the prior authorizations for the treatments, the insurance billing. Is that all handled at the state level, or is that handled by the subcontracting agency?
Most of that would be handled by the contracting agency.
Okay, and one last question. Like if there's insurance collections, does the lead agency pay for the services up front and then the insurance collections are reimbursed to the lead agency, or is that withheld first and then
We pay behind.
behind? Okay,
Yes.
all right. I believe that answers my questions, and thank you for your information.
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure that I have clarity on that by meaning that you pay behind. The contracting agency bills for the services rendered and then you pay them.
Correct.
And
Yes.
then, but you as a lead agency do the billing and collections, which stays within your lead agency.
No, the agencies do the billing and then they submit anything that they're owed after insurance is paid. So, so if they're owed additional,
Okay,
does that make sense? Yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
On prior approval, do you have the typical prior approval where once the child meets eligibility criteria for OPTP, PT speech, that then their insurance agency has to approve with the signature from their provider?
So I was on a call with other states last week, and I think what I'm learning is that there's no such thing as typical processes, and that every state seems to have different regulations around this. So, and this is a little bit outside my area of understanding exactly what those steps are for service coordinators or for the agencies. So I do know that getting orders is something that, for the most part, I believe that if orders are needed, our contract agencies handle it. But there are times where they can't get it and our service coordinators work on it. And I think it just becomes an IFSP team. Everyone's trying to get what's needed so that the child can get services processed. But that would be a question I'd have to get more specifics on, I think.
Thank you. Any other questions from the group?
Hey, Dr. Buttress, this is Dr. Tanya Fitz in Oxford, and I have a question about what does your interpretation services look like? Or is it a live person that goes one-to-one, or is it like an iPad FaceTime type thing, or what does that really look like, and how do you go about contracting that?
So our contracts team does the contracts. So for our lead agency services, so it'd be IFSP meetings, things like that. We would be providing the interpreter. For service provision, the service provider would be responsible if an interpreter is needed for that. And so that's part of what's spelled out in the contract, who's responsible for providing an interpreter when. We contract with interpreters for a variety of services, variety of languages, and then also sign language interpreters. And so that we use a person to go into the home or to join online whenever we can. We also have, if needed for things like appointment scheduling, it works pretty well, a language line where you can call and then they can call and try to schedule. But that doesn't work as well for a longer meeting. Like if you're in the home, that doesn't work as well as having a person there. I'm not aware of us using an iPad or something like that for like an IFSP meeting or something. It could be that if you just need to for a one quick sentence, like, you know, kind of thing, maybe somebody would use that, but I think that would be a very limited usage. And then for documents that need to be translated, we have a service that we work with for that. Most of our forms are available in Spanish and Arabic. And then we would, if other languages are needed or if specifics of the document are needed, we would get those translated.
Dr. Buttress, can I ask a question? This is Sarah Myers.
Certainly.
This is more in relation to the service providers perspective and kind of involvement in the IFSP and the teaming process you spoke of. How are you ensuring with the dedicated service provider model that there is this collaboration around and access, I suppose would be a good word, for the IFSP and the development and change of goals and things of that nature? I know that's been one hiccup that we, at least our region, has run into from time and again, is kind of ownership of the plan and, you know, collaboration and understanding from both the provider's perspective of, you know, what those result outcomes need to be and why and how decisions are made. Can you just speak a little bit, maybe expand more about how that works with your service coordinators? You know, I know you talked about monthly, maybe interfaces with the providers, but how you ensure that works. And maybe this is a little more in Susan's realm as well.
So I think this gets into, part of it is the training piece. But our service coordinators, and particularly the developmental therapy providers, really do work hand in hand. Like they have very close working relationships. And the majority of our kids have what we call an early interventionist or developmental therapy provider. And those agencies, that service isn't billed through insurance, like TIS is sole payer for those services. And we work really closely with them, and we have regionally, I know they have regular meetings with those providers. And then monthly we have statewide meetings. And so we work really hand in hand. And so I would say that there's just continuous communication, because a lot of times those are geographically based. So it's a lot of times that service coordinator and that developmental therapy provider is really a paired team. Like they really work very closely together. I think the little bit more challenging turn is really making sure that other service providers are in that fold. And that's something that we continue to work on. Part of that is our training process and rolling out new opportunities, really bringing in those providers into our conference. In the last year, we were able to do that. That's something we hope to continue, is really introducing early intervention like concepts and approaches a little more broadly. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it touched on the ideas.
This is Susan. I wanted to, because from a provider person, like, you know, from being on the outside, I think also the local agencies, all the local TEISs have it's called a local interagency council. And so that's not just statewide, like we come in from the state interagency council, that's great. But if you really want to get to know what's going on in each district, that, those 9 districts, it's great to go to those. They call them LICC meetings. And those, a lot of the providers come to those so they can kind of be kept in the know of what's going on with TEIS. And if they have issues, they bring it up there. I mean, it's like a networking event. I really love it because it's a networking event for those providers in the community to come and talk about what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. I just love that. So I just wanted to, you kind of danced around it, but I don't think I wanted them to know it was done locally in each little district. So it's very helpful.
Thank you both.
I have a question.
Dr. Walker.
Actually, I might have 2. The first is, do you, outside of kind of the standard service provider, OT, PT, speech, developmental therapist, does Tennessee Early Intervention provide behavioral health services for children enrolled through early intervention? Can you tell us what type of provider you contract with or use for those services? What services are being offered? And then does Tennessee Early Intervention assess for and help diagnose autism and then provide behavioral treatments for autism under early intervention services?
So our primary contract for this is actually, and I can't believe I haven't mentioned them before now, is with Vanderbilt's Triad. So if you're familiar with their program, so we have a contract with them. And so a large part of that contract is for the diagnosis and then services to children with autism and behavioral services. So what we love about the Triad model is that they will work with that developmental therapy provider, that early interventionist. And so their intervention a lot of times is actually with the provider. Like they'll provide some supports, but in addition to that, they're working with the provider and really bolstering their skill set, which helps benefit all of the children that provider serves. So it's a wonderful model. It's a great support. We do have other contracts, unfortunately, Triad can't be in all places at all times. So we do have other contracts for behavioral therapy and behavioral supports, but we do like them to model that Triad one as closely as possible, or it could be just for some behavioral support services. So.
Any further questions?
May I ask one quick question? And I promise I won't have any more. So Shannon, again, thank you so much for all of this. So I'm wondering, you talked pretty at length about the contract model that you have and how different agencies apply. And then also, if I'm understanding correctly, you are the monitoring component to Part C in Tennessee as well too. So what happens if you have an agency who is consistently falling short with specifically the criteria that you're reporting to OSEP every year? Are there certain safeguards that you have for those agencies? Do you support them in ways that provide additional training and support? Do they not get a contract reissued? What does that look like?
So we have, in addition to the monitoring that we're doing around the OSEP indicators, we also have a component within our department around licensure. And so there are certain things, it's a certain checklist that they're looking at with providers specifically and having things in place. So there's some additional monitoring pieces aside from what my team is doing, which is really specific to those IDEA federal regulations. But if, for example, we were to get, because a lot of the findings and the things that my team is doing is really focused on the, like we would issue a finding with the point of entry office, and then they would work with developing an action plan that might target working with providers as an example. But say, for example, we were getting, specific complaints about a provider that led to an investigation. That would be a circumstance where we would involve our legal department in determining, what course of action would we require of a particular contract program. And so we have in there, of course, clauses in our contracts that would allow us to terminate a contract for cause, or our determination process that we do would allow, it has a system of enforcements that said, if this, these are the possible options under. So if a point of entry office met, they were in needs intervention for several years, you could look at, well, why does this keep occurring? And so if you could pinpoint a specific contract or an issue there, then you could look at approaching it that way.
Hi, I have a question about screenings and also about your referral form. So I'm curious, coming from a child care perspective, I'm just curious how many people fill out the form that aren't parents or guardians. And then I'm also curious about screenings and if that's something how that's coordinated, especially in childcare.
So we have our top referral sources by far are people in the medical field. So that would be doctors, hospitals, specialty providers, our next highest group is parents, and our next highest group is DCS. And then a very small sliver of the pie, if you're looking at a pie chart, is everybody else. And so that includes our childcare centers, Head Start programs, anyone else. But we have tried to design a form that anyone can fill out. And in fact, our referral team they're looking at making changes to the form so that the first question is, who's filling it out? And so then they could really target the questions based on who's completing it. Right now, we ask that at the end versus the beginning. So that would allow them to really hone in on what questions can we skip based on who's completing it. But we get a lot of families that complete the form, for sure. But we don't get very many. When you look at the big picture overall, we don't get a lot of referrals from childcare centers. Or childcare homes. I've done some training with, in Tennessee, it's TECTA, but it's the childcare centers and homes. And one of the things that they expressed concern about is how to talk to parents about the results of the screening. So,
thank you.
So that was one of the reasons, that they expressed. But that's something, Susan, we worked with in particular areas of the state, is implementing screening programs in childcare centers.
Well, I want to thank you, Shannon and Susan, both for your time. Shannon, I know we just threw a ton at you both, and I appreciate you taking the time. I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, if we have, after we sort of digest all this, if if you would be willing for our core team here, Emily or Mary Claire or myself, to contact you if we have any further questions. We won't put you on the hot seat like this again, though.
Of course, of course. I'm happy. And if there's anything that I didn't explain very well, which results in more questions, please just come back.
Dr. Buttress, this is Kate Clark. Can I ask one more question real fast?
Of course.
So Shannon, thank you for today and all that you've offered. I have one question. You talked about extended options for families after the age of 3. Can you talk about that just real briefly and who the
Yes.
funding source for that is?
So the funding is a combination of state and federal funds. So it would be the same as our regular services. And if you visit our website, we have a whole section on the extended option. But to be eligible, a child has to have entered Part C, so entered early intervention before the age of 3, and been eligible, had an IFSP in place. When they're approaching their 3rd birthday, when they turn 3, they would go through the Part B eligibility process. And then if they're eligible for Part B, and this isn't our rule, this is the federal rule. So they have to go through the eligibility process. If they're eligible for Part B 619 services, then they would have a choice of staying in Part C and continuing their Part C services, or moving on to those Part B services. So, and we currently offer it up to the start of school following the child's 4th birthday. We launched that October 15th of 2022. So a year, less than a year. And we're waiting on the final approval to move to the 5th birthday, the start of school following the child's 5th birthday.
This is Carlin Hennington. I have a follow-up question to the extended option. In Mississippi, students who are eligible for Part B following Part C can go to an early childhood education program. Do the services occur within that context, or does the child forgo early childhood educational services, say in the local public school, that sort of thing? And how do you account for natural environments and that sort of thing for this age group?
So if they stay in Part C, they can have all of their same Part C services that they had been receiving. So, if they were getting services in their home, if they were getting services in wherever they were getting their services, whatever services they were getting, their IFSP would stay, and they can keep getting those services. We do have some kids that opt to go to a Head Start program, and then we would provide those same services there, or a childcare center, but they cannot simultaneously have an IFSP and an IEP. So if the family chooses to go on to Part B and have an IEP, they can't come back to Part C. It's a one-way door.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes.
And Mary Claire is telling me that she will send a link to the website, Tennessee's website, early intervention, so we can all peruse more of that. It sounds like you've got some great information there.
Our communications team does a great job with it. I think so. Yeah, there's good stuff.
Well, thank you again. We really appreciate it and appreciate your time, and we will keep you abreast with what's going on with Mississippi.
Thank you so much.
All right. So feel free to sign off if I'm sure you have other things to do. But we are not done yet. That was just for Shannon and Susan team. Y'all are stay. Because the next thing on the schedule is a discussion with our State Department of Health and Dr. Edney and Miss Adcock. And so Chris, I think you're up first to talk to us a little bit about some operational updates. And thank you for being here with us.
Sure, thank y'all. Thank you to Tennessee. I'm not sure if they're still on or not. That was extremely helpful and insightful. But as you guys can tell, we have been unpacking the program a little bit, for lack of a better term. And from Shannon's overview, you can see that there is a lot to unpack when you look at a whole Part C program that we administer. Can y'all hear me? Okay. So we've been looking at the program to see where we can make some improvements in what we need to do. And also we're looking at piloting a service delivery model with our partners at Mississippi State. And then I think Dr. Edney's going to give some additional information on the pay and chase model that we've been talking about. So in looking at the program and looking at the possible improvements that we can make to the program, we've narrowed it down to about 5 major categories to tackle initially. The first thing is the referral process. We actually have been looking at Tennessee's online referral form and really think that that's something that we can look at incorporating that. Now, you guys know when I say that, that's going to take some system change and some process improvement. But we think that that's one area that we can really focus on to try to increase our referrals also. So I'm sure we'll be reaching out to Shannon and her team about that referral form. We've also been looking at staffing with our service coordinators and where we need to build that infrastructure a little bit. We've been looking at the training that they're required to go through during their first stages of employment and what that ongoing training needs to look like. We've also been looking at average caseload size for our support coordinators, service coordinators. In a former life, I dealt with support coordinators. But to look at, is there also some caseload management strategy that can be put in place to help them there? In doing that, we know that we need to bring on some resources to help us look at our data. As Mary Claire can probably attest to, we have a mountain of data, and we really need to start to look at how we can use that to our advantage to improve services for our families. In addition to the online referral piece, we want to look at training regarding our referrals. What we're finding is that we get a lot of referrals, and a lot of referrals come to us without complete medical records. And sometimes that just delays the eligibility process and the enrollment process for families. And so we want to do everything that we can to expedite that process as much as possible. And then we also want to look at how we incorporate the child development degrees within the program. We've incorporated those degree types for service coordination, but we also know that we need to incorporate those degree types for our service array. So I've been reaching out to some internal and external partners about how to do that and how we might expedite that process. So those are the 5 big ticket items that we're really looking at operationally right now. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Are there any questions from our task force or advisors? Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Dr. Edney, you're next.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Buttress and fellow task force members. Today, I'm just going to review quickly with you how billing currently looks, and it will clarify why I do think we need to look at a new model. And pay and chase is definitely an intriguing model that I'm hoping would work for us. With significant challenges between here and there, but I just truly believe we can get to yes on that issue. So for billing in this program, first of all, every service provider has a contract with the agency, and they are required to be Medicaid providers, and then they can contract with any third party plan that they would like, they have to be a Medicaid provider because that's going to be the lion's share of where those third-party resources are going to originate. And as our providers in the field provide service, then they are responsible for billing the third-party payers based on the contracts that they have in place. And if they receive payment, great. And if they don't, if they are underpaid or not paid for whatever reason, then they submit to the program. And we have we call it the PLR, the Payer of Last Resort account. Now, for us to legally pay out of that account, the feds require us to document and prove to them that every reasonable attempt towards collection from another payer source occurred. And if there is clear documentation, then we're allowed to make them whole. And, you know, we have our own fee schedule out of that account. And I think everybody knows that a year ago, we increased those fees 20% to try to help with that shortfall. That anybody who's been in private practice, including myself, understands that is a long process. It's a long process getting third-party payers to pay you, period. That can be 1 to 3 months before you're reimbursed. And then you may be, and based on the denial, you still have to be willing to refile with corrections. And we have to look at all that. Once you hit the end of that road and you pivot to us, well, then there's a whole nother process and another timeline. And in my opinion, that is too long and it's a burden on our providers. So the pay and chase model makes a great deal of sense from a process standpoint to me, and that our providers contract with us, they provide the service, they submit the invoice to us, and if the contract's in place and we verify the services have been rendered, then we pay. And that's the end of it for the providers. And then it would be on us to pivot and go after the money from the third-party payers. And if it takes us 3 months, it just takes us 3 months. And then when we're at the end of the road and we have verified there is no payer out there, then we can go to the PLR account and the program can be reimbursed. Sounds easy. It's going to take some significant infrastructure to do that. The program right now costs about $10 million to run. And that's our cost. We have no idea how much Medicaid is reimbursing private providers. We're not involved in that loop. And we have no idea what other private insurers are paying. And that is a box, that's a number we must know to do a pay and chase model. And I can tell you how much PLR funds go out. And, I can tell you what the overhead of the program runs. And right now we're balancing out pretty closely. And, the agency has certainly no windfall from this program, but it's not costing the agency. I'm not having to divert public health funding from the county health departments to support the program. It's pretty much taking care of itself. But for a pay and chase to work, we will have to have a bank up front that can cover all of the third-party invoices and can cover right now, what we're paying out in PLR, just to take care of providers. And that's going to be a lot of money. We don't know how much, but it's going, I would say pay of last resort is probably the smaller component of what providers are getting. I would expect Medicaid will be the lion's share. And as long as we have the resources to start that, then with one-time resources, then it will just replenish itself as we collect the funds or from the grant funding. So, and then there's also going to be a need for infrastructure, and very likely probably the smartest thing to do up front would be to contract out a lot of the services that right now are not built in to the program, at least until things mature and we can get our arms around costs just to keep overhead down and make sure we're efficient in our billing and our collections. So that's comparison of where we are now, which I think is onerous versus where we would like to go, which would be miraculous. It may be something in between. It's very important to know targeted case management, as Tennessee is doing at the central level, is a huge part of funding this program. All of those Medicaid dollars go right back into paying providers. And remind y'all that right now we're paying 25% of those funds for our Medicaid match to draw down 4 times as much from the feds. We're in a unique role to do that. So as we make those decisions to fund the program in a way that we can do pay and chase, the lead agency will have to have the resources to do it. And Dr. Budge will be happy to answer any questions.
I'm told by our team that the Medicaid claims numbers are being worked on right now.
Right.
So that's really good news. I would think, not being an early intervention provider, but one who refers in, my thought is this would be a huge relief if the pay and chase model was implemented. I've been in private practice. It's been many years ago, but I do remember, and I still know even at our university system, trying to get everything taken care of and the back and forth, it can be a big relief to have a stable salary. And I believe this may be one of the reasons that some of our providers have left early intervention services, is because it's hard to survive when you're waiting 3 or 4 months to get paid. I'd love to hear from other members of our task force, any thoughts or comments or questions that you have for Dr. Edney and Ms. Adcock.
Can I ask a clarifying question for Dr. Edney? This is Sarah. You spoke about the pay and chase model, and I understand absolutely that, would help with Medicaid. Are you also referring to private insurances as well? Would the EI program assume the responsibility of finding those funds as well and pay out through an invoice for the providers?
Yes, so we would all have to be in-network providers, which the agency is. The agency as a whole is a contracted provider as an entity with just about every plan out there. But yes, basically, Sarah, you would submit an invoice to us for the services you provided, that'd be verified, and then we would send payment. And then we would go after collecting from the insurance companies.
Dr. Edney, this is Dr. Fitz in Oxford again. We have a lot of feedback that our MCOs are giving our therapy providers a really hard time about prior authorizations. With this pay and chase model, would y'all be doing those PAs and getting things approved, or would it be still up to the therapy providers to submit their claims to the, submit the PAs to the MCOs?
Thank you for sharing that with me, because we can put that on our list of things to talk about with division leadership, because prior authorizations do not have to be mandated. Medicaid just waived, there are a lot of things that PAs are not required for. And, but the way I would see it, as long as we have the infrastructure, then we would be happy to take on that burden. I want to take all the burdens off our providers that we can, so we have the highest number of providers providing the quickest access for our children that we can.
That would be amazing, because I know that is a block that we have right now, and it often causes delay, and that presented itself as a complaint from when we had our open forum for information. That came up more than once. So,
and we have a seat on the medical advisory committee for Medicaid, so these are things that we can communicate in multiple ways. The other thing that has to happen, we would have to be allowed to be a billing agent, for Medicaid for our providers, which obviously Tennessee is able, to do. I don't see that being a hurdle that we can't cross.
Dr. Edney, I have a couple of questions, but it seems like there's one in the chat and one I was wondering as well. Does the health department do a pay and chase program for any other or pay and chase model for any other program that's run through the health department?
We do not. In fact, this is the only time in human history I've ever heard of such a thing in medicine. And the only thing that worries me is it makes too much sense. And so that tells me there are landmines in state government somewhere, but I think it's extremely unique, and it would be a tremendous model that, for us to apply in other areas if we have that initial funding to cover the invoices.
And thank you. And then my other question it's just more of a clarifying question. You mentioned that it costs $10 million to run the program. Is that right?
Yeah, somewhere between 9 and 10. I can't quote you the exact figure, but it's somewhere in there. And it appears to be closer to 10.
Okay. And what is the federal and state contribution to the program?
The federal contribution is 4.2 million. The state contribution before last year was running about $1 million, and it was increased by 2 million. But that 2 million increase in the state maintenance of effort, however, has to go into the PLR fund to take care of providers.
Okay. And so how do you make up that other amount?
We make it up. Part of the maintenance of state effort is not directed. So it's about $1 million that we use of state resources to help run the program. And then the targeted case management money that we provide the service, bill Medicaid, and collect goes right back into the program. The only thing coming out of the program has to do with admin from the federal grant, which is virtually mandated, and then our overhead off our Medicaid billing for our revenue cycle to bill and collect that. And then we have the 25% of our Medicaid billing that goes to the Medicaid match.
Okay. Is it possible if the program can run at a deficit then? If you're not getting the billing that you need to make up that difference?
Yeah, that one thing we don't do at the health department, we don't run deficits.
Okay.
We don't, we have never, at least in modern history, asked for a deficit appropriation. I don't intend to be the first state health officer to do it. And I have stated to y'all before, I don't have the resources outside the program to bring into the program to fund a deficit, which is why the model we all come up with together must be funded. And I just don't have, if I'm pulling money from somewhere else, I'm pulling money from maternal infant death programs, county health departments, core public health. So we have to make this program stand on its own 2 feet. And I believe we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from our task force or advisors?
Dr. Edney, I'd like to ask, and Ms. Adcock, the Tennessee representative talks about, they had changed their release forms. I guess she was talking about the ones that parents sign so that the referring provider got updates from the IFSP. And so I know y'all talked about you were going to do more training with your referring providers. Is that something that y'all have looked into?
So we haven't looked into that specifically already, but when Shannon brought that up today, I thought it was a very good point that we can look into. That way there's a feedback loop with our referral sources.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Ms. Adcock, this is a question for you. This is Sarah. You spoke about looking at the service coordinator caseloads currently and trainings and supports for them. Are you seeing any potential right now for service coordinators to be trained to be PSPs or also provide services?
So Sarah, I've seen that in other programs that I have designed where there is a primary service coordinator model that can also serve a dual role. A lot of times in children's mental health, you guys know that they do that with wraparound. So I think it is an option for us to look at, yes.
Great questions, everyone. I don't want to cut us off unless we're finished. We actually have a few more minutes if we need them, and then we need to talk about our next meeting.
I have one more question. I'm so sorry.
Go ahead.
Is there any interest in looking at recruiting or contracting with different service providers to provide behavioral health services to children under Part C?
Hey, Courtney, I'm always going to say yes to that question.
Yay, great. Okay.
Yeah, and as our discussions go on, we can talk about who those would be and the like. I think there's go ahead.
Yeah, can I ask a question too? The extended services that they spoke of earlier in Tennessee, as y'all are looking, can y'all just kind of peruse that option? That's probably down the road, but I think that would be a tremendous option for possibly families and for school districts. We have so many children that get early intervention services and then they go to the local LEA, and there's a tremendous gap in there, particularly if there's some type of service that is not typically provided by that school district. So if that's something that y'all could just kind of keep an open mind to, I'm not going to ask you to do that immediately, but if we could kind of look at that option, I think it would be a tremendous benefit to the state.
Thank you, Senator Boyd. I see some nods. That would take, obviously, even more money. But one of the big issues that we also have heard in our feedback is the transition piece where children, when they do get early intervention services that are good, then get, for whatever reason, drop. There's not a seamless handoff like there's supposed to be. So yeah, that intrigued me too. But then I know just if we could fix the birth to 3 and then look at that transition would be incredible.
When,
Not if, when. Thank you. Thank you for that correction.
Susan, this is Heather Hannah. I was wondering if I could ask just a general process question.
Sure.
So, Mary Claire and Emily have done such a tremendous job, collecting and synthesizing data. I'm so impressed. And just to make sure that those data we're using those and that they're driving our process. I'm wondering if it makes sense, and I may be getting ahead, but if it makes sense for us to look at those data and pick out states that have similar demographic, economic, and political profiles as Mississippi, as well as significantly better early intervention outcomes. And then also look at their return on investment, because it seems to vary pretty wildly in terms of the total expenditures per state. If we look at that by the number of children ages 0 to 3 in that state relative to the percentage of children served, I think that could potentially be very helpful for us as a state, given that our overall budget is not as high as other states. And my first glance, I know West Virginia really stands out. And maybe if we took that approach and identified a few states, and we could have conversations with them as well as Tennessee, and maybe pick out the pieces and the parts that we think address some of our concerns here in Mississippi and could help us cobble together the best possible plan, if that makes sense.
Hey, thank you so much for your comments. I've noticed the same thing as I was going across several states, and these were brought up by Dr. Buttress or in the Senate hearings on the women and children and families last year, of other states that do compare to Mississippi demographically. And West Virginia is one that is quite similar in terms of poverty and just numbers of children in the state population numbers. And yet they're at the highest of near the highest percentage of children served in the state. So I think that would be a really great state to consider just based on the comparisons with Mississippi.
The other variable, though, that wasn't said is Medicaid expansion. So expansion states are very different from non-expansion states. And we need to be looking at non-expansion states. An expansion state is a whole different world.
It's a really good point. Thank you, Heather, Dr. Hannah, for that. And yes, I think that is something that we've discussed. I'm glad you mentioned, Dr. Edney, the Medicaid expansion versus non-expansion, and we'll make sure we check on that. Certainly, yeah, we'll look into that. Okay. So any other questions for Chris or Dr. Edney at this point? If not, we'll move toward the last few minutes of our meeting, where we just wanted to let everybody know that, just like Dr. Hannah mentioned, our staff has really been going through a lot of the data and making sure that our data gathering is all in place, because our goal is by November 1 to have a report draft already done November 1. So we have just a few weeks to finish all this data gathering. And so the staff will be sending a list of issues that were identified during this meeting and our others, the research, everything, and then possible recommendations coming up. So they've ordered us to have each task force member and advisor rank the issues by what you believe are the most important and should be addressed in the task force report and our recommendations that we make. So this will happen. When do y'all plan on having this all compiled? I know we're going to meet afterwards to discuss some of this. Yeah, so it'll go out pretty quickly is the plan. And prior to our next meeting, it will go out. So please be on the lookout. Again, to me, this is one of the more exciting task force I've been in on, because there's real movement, there's real information gathering, and there's a real endpoint. That's what a task force is supposed to be, right? Tasked to do a job that you finish. So I guess I can say to our legislators who are on the call still, thank you for having a finite time to this, but I will say, boy, talk about a lot of pressure. But I do believe we've made some progress and I appreciate everybody. Do we have a new meeting date set yet?
It is September 26th at 1 p.m. And I'll be sending out the Zoom and all of that information, the calendar invite after the meeting. I didn't want to confuse anyone by sending it out early, so.
Thank you for that, Mary Claire. And I will say that, again, I know I keep thanking everybody, but thank you for taking your time. We've had great attendance on this task force. It tells me that everybody believes this is important. And so let's keep going. Again, like I said, there's a finite time. I know it's taken a lot of your time away from your, as I call it, the paid job, but this will make a difference. So thank you. And unless there's any other thought or comment, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn from Dr.
Thank you,
Fitz.
Dr. Fitz. Second? I think I heard a second. Oh, Dr. Edney. Okay. We're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.